At dawn, the surveyor's tape stretched across basalt lintels at Kerbet El Dir, digits glowing 4.3 meters under a milky Levantine haze, the measurement whispering of doorways tall enough to invite the giants of the Rephaim. Hardened dust clung to the canvas of notebooks as Dr. Hana Rasawi brushed away flint flakes, noting volcanic inclusions that dated the stones to the 13th century BCE, the same horizon as the biblical age of the Nephilim. Perfumed sage smoke drifted from a nearby shepherd's brazier, folding into the trench and mingling with the copper tang of disturbed earth, as if the ground exhaled a forgotten legend. Theodolite clicks punctured the hush, each metallic chirp challenging the claim that builders of impossible stature once strode here. Yet the weight of the lintel, 9.6 metric tons according to the hoist scales, proved that ordinary hands risked collapse to raise what stories say, giants shaped with ease. If this quiet history soothes you, please subscribe. Under the low amber lamp inside the site tent, Hannah warmed her palms around a tin mug of cardamom coffee, its steam tracing ribbons through the cool night while cicadas rehearsed their endless chorus outside. The grit beneath her nails tasted faintly of salt, a reminder that this plateau once watched over late bronze caravans bound for Lake Hule. Soft goat-hide gloves lay folded beside a set of bone calipers, the tools glinting like patient fireflies in the lamplight as she sketched the lintel's pitted surface. Beyond the tent flap, starlight silvered the basalt blocks, and the distant Jordan shimmered like beaten foil, promising a chill that would sink into any traveller's bones before sunrise. Hana whispered into her tape recorder about the mythic gatekeepers known as Nephilim, careful to note the differential weathering on the western face. The microphone caught the hush between her words, that trembling space where scholarship brushes against folklore and a contemporary visitor confronts the spectre of not surviving a single night if the age she studies were to return. Outside, the flutter of moth wings brushed the canvas in time with distant water wheels, steadying her thoughts. She imagined the lintel reassembled in its original gateway, every grain of stone warmed briefly by the breath of giants who might have been disciplined warriors rather than monsters. In the 13th century BCE, when Egyptian viceroys listed Bashan among rebellious territories, the basalt strongholds around Kerbet El Dir demanded acclimated lungs and hardened skin from anyone daring to enter. Excavated hearths show charred aurochs marrow bones cracked with stone hammers, the residue thick with collagen that would sour a modern stomach unaccustomed to such ferrous diets. Night temperatures plunged toward 8 degrees C, even in harvest months, and the prevailing katabatic wind sliced across the plateau, carrying silt that rasped against eyelids like powdered glass. Baked clay tablets from Ugarit catalogued tribute ode to rulers titled Sons of the Mighty, their scribes adding reed stylus impressions alongside inventories of scale armor stitched with rawhide that sweat would stiffen into abrasive shells. Ceramic strainers recovered nearby still hold crusted residue of mare's milk mixed with blood, an endurance tonic that curdled within hours unless consumed by seasoned stomachs. The ground vibrated with the shuffle of corvée labourers hauling timber for scaffolds, a rhythm that punished anyone whose stride faltered under the relentless metronome of drums. A visitor from our era, lacking both immunities to soil-borne parasites and the ritual knowledge of the Rephaim cult, would watch oil lamps gutter in the smoky temples and feel the air thicken with alkali dust that scalds the throat. Listening to the reedy wind seep through surviving wall seams, it is easy to imagine those giants not merely as gigantic bodies, but as guardians of a regime of pressure and sound tuned to expel the uninitiated. The basalt dampened footsteps until they felt stolen, and incense thick with mastish resin perfumed corridors that only those trained from childhood could traverse without dizziness. Gentle moonlight would have traced the same grooves now under Hannah's fingertips, yet to the residents it signalled curfews enforced by sentries whose stature, real or legendary, embodied law. Could anyone parachuted from the modern world survive the relentless choreography of offerings, kneels, and coded knocks demanded before dawn? Lignite smoke would stain the roof beams, and flakes drifted down like dark snow, freckles that only loyal households learned to ignore. The very dust between flagstones tasted of old salt offerings, a mineral reminder that obedience seeped into every sip and sigh. The mind softens under lullabies of cicadas. Still, the skin bristles at the idea of being judged by unseen watchers. Even the silence between drums tasted of expectation, a flavor that would overwhelm today's restless pulse. Farther south on the Golan Heights, the concentric basalt rings of Rujma el Hiri, also called Gilgal Rephaim, span 59 meters, their outer walls measuring 3.5 meters thick and rising to a preserved height of 2.1 meters, built from an estimated 42,000 tons of stone ferried without mortar. Survey drones recorded magnetic anomalies at dawn, the instruments humming softly as dew collected on their carbon fiber frames and the cold air smelled of crushed thyme. The central tumulus holds a cyst aligned to solstitial beams, implying sentinels who read light like scripture and punished intruders who failed to stand in shadow at the appointed minute. The sand remembers the pace of their ritual steps, the instruments hum, the hollow waits for breaths you should never offer. The floor littered with shards of hammerstones suggests that raw knuckles and cracked wrists were acceptable sacrifices for maintaining defenses that legend later assigned to towering Nephilim bodies. Even today, lizards basking on those rocks dart away as if respecting patrol routes, their claws scratching whispers into the stone that sound like orders being passed down the line. Standing within those rings, even through a historian's imagination, the low murmur of wind colliding with layered stone produces a bass note that vibrates through the ribs, persuading the body that giants still patrol unseen. Torchlight would have swayed, casting tall silhouettes that merged with the walls and turned every observer into a shortened trespasser in need of permission. The basalt's chill clung to every inhalation, and the taste of moisture drawn from the Sea of Galilee dawns would cling to lips like an oath. What soft-spoken traveller today could meet such resonant expectations without betraying fear in each heartbeat? Pleated cloaks would brush the basalt with a soft hiss, reinforcing the impression of height with every measured stride. The breath of comrades mingled with the mineral scent to form a dense canopy that pressed gently upon the crown of any outsider. Legends hardened not because of exaggeration, but because the architecture continued to rehearse their scale even after the builders fell silent. Each pebble crunch underfoot becomes a measured response, a rhythmic reply to voices you cannot hear yet, somehow feel brushing your earlobes. Contemporary cuneiform from Ima and the Amana letters mention unrest involving Rapa Utu, a term philologists connect to the Rephaim, showing that the ideology of outsized ancestors shaped diplomatic anxieties as much as physical encounters. Tablets EA-273 and EA-325 reference shipments of bronze spearheads weighing 6 shekels each, heavier than standard infantry equipment, suggesting elite troops whose training normalized weight that would wrench modern shoulders. Temple inventories list cedar oil mixed with hematite dust for anointing warriors, a slick compound that stained skin crimson and made grips treacherous for anyone unused to ritual lubrication. As scribes etched the tallies, beads of sweat ran down temples despite the night breezes, and the taste of tin from bronze shavings lingered on their tongues. Those records, weighted by seals smelling of bitumen, show administrative precision deployed like armor against both mortal rivals and the myths breathing down their necks. Torches flickered against the inscriptions, revealing strokes carved deep enough to hold shadow even at noon, and the low rumble of priests chanting syllables older than Iron Age empires pressed against the chest like a second heartbeat. The textual record combines with the archaeological residue to indicate a cultural ecosystem posing lethal expectations on stamina, obedience, and diet. Reading those tablets beneath a soft tent lantern, the clay smells faintly of river mud and old honey, inviting the mind to drift toward the idea that the Nephilim were less bodies than the sum of obligations that swelled beyond ordinary scale. Their presence lived in the weight of the spear, the thickness of the oil, the density of oaths etched into basalt as though the stone itself could swear. A modern visitor's breath would fog under the strain of keeping pace with incantations timed to drumbeats that never hesitated for fatigue. Wax from the lamp softened between fingers, releasing a faint honeyed scent that soothed even as the tales stiffened the spine. In the glow, shadows stretched across the tablets like elongated limbs, quietly reinforcing the notion that unseen figures still shared the chamber. The papyrus edges rasped like reeds in evening breezes, and that gentle sound reminds the listener that survival required mastering an acoustic code as demanding as any physical gate. Instead of monsters, the ancients built atmospheres, and those atmospheres would swallow an untrained guest before the first sunrise arrived. Bioarchaeologists cataloguing skeletal remains from Tel Es-Sa'afi, often associated with Gath of the Giants, report femoral lengths averaging 48.7 centimeters, significantly above regional norms, accompanied by enthesopathies indicating intense ligament strain from repeated load-bearing. The burial pits smell of damp limestone and decayed reed mats, and the matrix is peppered with barley chaff charred during rapid cooking, implying kitchens that ran night and day to feed defenders at scales beyond typical settlements. Grinding stones show polish dominated by emmer rather than wheat, and residue analysis reveals high levels of saponin-rich legumes that would cause gastric distress in anyone unaccustomed to soaking routines timed to lunar calendars. Excavated storage jars still cling to residues of rendered fat blended with wild garlic, a pungent concoction that coated throats before night drills. Grinding those ingredients on basalt querns produced a muffled growl that reverberated through courtyards, warning strangers that kitchens doubled as armories of endurance. Fires crackled with resinous terebinth, filling halls with a tart haze that clung to lungs and eyes. The age of the Nephilim, anchored in these data points, demanded bodies conditioned to bear both physical and ritual burdens that would buckle a traveller born of central heating and filtered water. Sitting by the reconstructed hearth, the smoke threads through the hair and perfumes clothing with a bittersweet bite that lingers long after the embers dim, reminding us that sustenance came entwined with discipline. The notion of Nephilim superiority settles not in towering silhouettes, but in the choreography of breath, blink, and swallow under air heavy with terebinth oils. Would your heart beat slow enough to match the cadence of watchers who measured loyalty by how slowly a guest drank from communal bowls? Ash settled on eyelids, soft as powdered velvet, until blinking became an exercise in discipline. Even the lullabies sung nearby carried minor tones that wrapped around the ears like braided cords, keeping every listener tethered to duty. The stone benches still hold the chill of ancestors, and brushing their surfaces with warm fingers reveals how quickly modern skin protests. Even the lull of distant jackals becomes a metronome against which every movement feels either too rushed or too fragile. The giant's age keeps testing the softness of visitors more than the height of their frames. In 1898, Field Captain Charles Warren revisited the ruined dolmens near Deir Allah and unearthed a clay jar sealed with bitumen, its belly packed with rolled linen around hematite pendants etched with the phrase, B'nai Elohim. Lantern light shimmered across the pendant grooves, the metallic sheen flickering like distant lightning as damp air smelled of overturned nettles. Warren's assistant recorded soil stratigraphy at 10-centimeter intervals, noting a carbon streak that placed the cache around 400 BCE, precisely the era when Canaanite texts spoke of towering guardians. The discovery exhaled cold breath from the trench, and for a moment the team felt the night drawing tight around their throats. The wind drummed the tent flaps, the river muttered, the hollow paused to listen for footsteps you feared. Each careful note, etched in graphite, challenged Victorian myths, while simultaneously feeding them, because artifacts meant to sanctify elite warriors now buttressed the legends of Nephilim dominion. The jar's linen crackled like dry leaves when unrolled, and fragments of ochre clung to fingertips, staining them with a ghostly blush that refused to wash away until morning. Yet Warren's report languished in Ottoman archives, because Provincial Governor Mehmed Arslan feared that tales of superhuman ancestors might ignite local uprisings, so he ordered the jar resealed and stored in a cedar chest perfumed with camphor. The scent of the wood mixed with the bitumen, creating a heady sweetness that cloaked the artifacts in quiet reverence, and the guards posted outside shuffled their sabers on mosaic floors to drown whispers. Scented candles flickered along the corridor, their flames bending toward the sealed chest as though acknowledging an invisible procession. Clerks dipped reed pens into walnut ink that perfumed the air with spice, layering bureaucracy atop legend until both became indistinguishable. The parchment docket, now brittle as moth wings, records the bureaucratic muting not as censorship but as civic protection, revealing how awe can masquerade as administrative routine. A traveller stepping into that chamber would feel the humid air cling to their lungs and realize that silence, here, was meant to prevent fear from snowballing into revolt. Suppression tasted of politeness and tea, not violence, yet it still locked the Nephilim legend beyond reach. Only in 1973 did curator Layla Haddad reopen the cedar chest during an inventory for the new Jordan Archaeological Museum, her cotton gloves brushing off camphor crystals that glittered like frost under fluorescent light. She photographed the pendants with a Hasselblad, the shutter clicking softly while the lab smelled of ethanol used to stabilize the linen. Radiocarbon analysis conducted in Zurich confirmed the late Bronze date, and a publication in the journal Levant tied the inscriptions to a protective cult rather than literal giants. A low hiss from the fume hood accompanied every swab, blending with the click of heels on linoleum to form a metronome of patient revelation. Even the desiccated linen smelled faintly of desert rain when warmed under conservation lights, stirring a nostalgia for storms nobody living remembers. The rediscovery unfurled like a long exhalation, each data point aligning legend with ritualized elite memory. Visitors who now stand before the glass case hear whispering air vents and see their reflections merging with the artifacts, a reminder that the age of the Nephilim survives in curated climates that still challenge modern hearts with ancient expectations. Watching schoolchildren press their palms against the cool display glass, you can almost taste the metallic tang of preserved hematite in the conditioned air. And the mind drifts toward what reverence feels like when it spans millennia. The legend of the Nephilim doesn't roar here. It hums through humidity monitors and soft footsteps cushioned by museum carpeting, proving that awe can be a gentle warden. Would anyone accustomed to instant explanations feel comfortable surrendering to such measured mysteries for even a day? Their reflections shimmer beneath the display's LED glow, elongating bodies into shadow giants that nod back at curious faces. The climate-controlled air carries a whisper of adhesives and old paper, a modern incense that sanctifies curiosity without letting it run wild. The fluorescence buzzes overhead, and in that thin sound we recognize how survival in the giant's age required patience with rituals that never hurried. Rediscovery becomes less about spectacle than about relearning how to stand still while history breathes against the skin. Excavations at Tel Dan reveal city gates over 4 meters thick, flanked by basalt orthostats burnished by repeated contact with lime-washed shields, indicating that defenders expected assaults powerful enough to warrant overbuilt defenses. The gate passage still smells of crushed limestone and charred cedar, residues from quicklime traps likely poured into the throat of the entry to blind opponents. Bronze arrowheads with wide tangs litter the threshold, their patina a blue-green sheen that glints in slanting sunlight like sleeping serpents. Archaeologists mapped the bolt impressions along the gate's inner jambs, each groove filled with compacted soot smelling of rancid oil from torches extinguished in haste. Audio reconstructions of clanging shields echo off the surviving stones, and the reverberations linger like invisible guards refusing to yield the passage. Assyrian annals referencing this region around 8045 BCE describe opponents as mighty like Anak, merging memory of giants with the brute reality of fortifications built to repel them. Any modern visitor stepping inside would hear their own breath bounce off the tight walls and feel sweat cooled instantly by shade, a reminder that the age of the Nephilim weaponized architecture and climate in tandem. The blocked gate narrows the sky to a slim ribbon, and the echo of your footsteps returns with a delay that prickles the skin, as though unseen sentries measured courage by resonance. The air tastes of metallic lime, drying the tongue within minutes, and the damp basalt sweats when twilight falls, coating fingers with mineral slickness. Could someone raised on open-plan living endure this corridor's embrace without misstepping into concealed pits, without betraying unease to guardians counting each inhalation? Moisture drips from the ceiling in slow beads, pattering onto shoulders with the cold insistence of a warning. The basalt's faint metallic taste coats the tongue, and every breath feels like inhaling the memory of warriors who never truly departed. Here the Nephilim legend acts like a pressure system, settling on shoulders until posture either stiffens in obedience or collapses. Even in imagination you sense the expectation to lower your gaze, to accept that the walls themselves listen more keenly than any human witness. High above the Horan Plain, the abandoned quarry at Al-Lajat displays grooves 40 centimeters deep, where sledges dragged monoliths destined for Nephilim. Associated sanctuaries, the basalt still bearing scars of copper chisels that sparked against the stone. Surface pollen trapped in fissures reveals thyme, pistacia, and wild cumin, filling the air today with warm, peppery fragrance that would have mingled with the sweat of labourers straining under loads exceeding a metric ton. Archaeomagnetic dating pins the quarry's peak activity between 1500 and 1250 BCE, aligning with the textual bloom of giant lore across Canaanite hymns. The sun lowers, shadows thicken, the basalt sighs, the hollow keeps count of unfinished dreams. When rain sweeps across the plateau, the quarry's channels gurgle with brown torrents that smell of copper filings, reactivating grooves carved millennia ago. Bats dart overhead, their wings brushing faces like leather gloves, enforcing the sense that the air itself remains on sentry duty. A modern body, lacking practice in balancing on clinker-strewn paths, would risk shattered ankles before nightfall, long before any mythical warrior lifted a hand. Imagining that quarry alive, you hear the scrape of sled runners and the guttural chants that steadied teams hauling stone, and that rhythm alone could undo a visitor unfamiliar with communal labour songs. The dust feathers across lips, tasting faintly of ashes and herbs, and the skin prickles where grit finds sweat. What happens when an outsider misses a beat, when the chant falters because one voice cracks? Drums carved from hollowed tamarisk trunks once set the pace, their skins stretched with goat hide that hummed beneath calloused palms. When a sled slipped, the resulting scream scraped down the cliffs, and afterward the chant resumed scraped down the cliffs, and afterward the chant resumed softer. Stories of the Nephilim become convenient explanations for brutal schedules that tolerated no missteps, and silence followed accidents lest rival cities learn of weakness. Reverence for the fallen mingled with pragmatic secrecy, so the quarry's hush today feels both tender and stern, like a hand resting on the shoulder until you remember to breathe in time. Scriptural references to the Nephilim in Genesis 64 and Numbers 13,033 entered scribal circulation during the exilic period, yet their phrasing leans on older Akkadian expressions like Elu Kerubu, literally divine warriors, hinting at a cross-pollinated mythos anchored in real military aristocracies. The Dead Sea Scroll fragment 4Q531, often called the Book of Giants, preserves a dream narrative where a giant sees a tablet swallowed by water, a metaphor etched into leather that smells of desert dust and aged parchment. Paleographic analysis shows the scribe's reed pen splitting near the loop of each aleph, suggesting hurried copying under cramped conditions, perhaps in a cave lit by smoking oil lamps. Fragments of ochre crumbled beneath the scribe's hand, staining the parchment's margin with rusty blooms that mirrored the apocalyptic visions within. Scholars handling the fragment today must breathe through masks that smell of latex and distilled water, replicating the controlled inhalations ancient copyists practiced for entirely different reasons. Carbonized wick fragments collected beside the manuscript emit a faintly bitter aroma when reheated, confirming the tight, oxygen-poor environment where these stories persisted. The textual evidence illustrates a world where cosmic rebellion mirrored the pressures of human hierarchy, reinforcing the peril faced by anyone who could not navigate both. In the cave where that fragment once rested, the walls sweat mineral tears, and moisture beads on fingertips as if the rock itself wished to cradle the words. Reading by soft lantern light, The crackle of the replica parchment sounds like distant brushfires, and each glyph feels like a heartbeat from an age that expected obedience to celestial judges. Tiny droplets gather on the cave ceiling and fall in irregular rhythms, tapping shoulders like measured blessings. The cool stone bench numbs thighs until sensation dissolves, and the mind floats between wakefulness and reverie, the same liminal state the text warns about with such urgency. Would you, cocooned in modern skepticism, manage to sleep in such a chamber knowing that dreams were once weighed for treason? The air carries the sharp tang of bat guano and stillness, a combination that presses gently yet persistently against the lungs. Here, mythology and discipline entwine until the boundary dissolves, and survival depends on respecting that blend without demanding it. Unravel for comfort. Assyrian reliefs from the reign of Ashurnasirpal II depict winged Apkallu, sages associated with primordial beings, standing guard over sacred trees with hands raised in protective gestures. Pigments preserved behind their beards retain traces of malachite and orpiment, minerals whose powder would have irritated untrained skin, verifying that the paint mixture was handled by specialists. When torches flared, the malachite shimmered like damp moss, and the reliefs seemed to flex, testing the resolve of anyone standing within scent range of the cedar smoke. Courtiers shuffled forward with offerings that clacked softly, every bead of carnelian warm from body heat and fear. The reliefs were set in throne rooms where cedar wood smoked in braziers, enveloping visitors in a resinous haze while carved eyes glittered with inlays of mother of pearl. Royal inscriptions call these figures offspring of the deep, blending aquatic myth with terrestrial might, and envoys from the Levant recorded the awe they inspired. Anyone entering barefoot or in wool, rather than regulation linen, risked rash and reprimand, showing how the atmosphere itself defended the elite like invisible Nephilim sentries. Standing before those reliefs in the dim gallery of Nimrod's northwest palace, the stone surfaces feel cool yet sticky with preserved oils, and the air tastes faintly of cedar resin even centuries later. The giants of lore linger in the way the carved muscles bulge despite the rock's resistance, persuading visitors that the ancients conversed with beings heavier than the walls themselves. Could you hold your gaze steady under those glittering shell eyes without yielding to the impulse to bow? The reliefs cast shadows that stretch into tapering triangles, and stepping into one feels like sliding beneath a giant's arm. Cold drafts swirl through broken windows, carrying the dusty taste of collapsed ceilings that once echoed with diplomatic pledges. The silence in the hall is maintained not by guards but by the weight of expectation, a gentler yet unyielding force that keeps conversations to whispers. Awe is the custodian here, and even in reflection the spine straightens as though responding to an unseen command. In 1123 CE, the pilgrim monk Matthias of Antioch described entering a collapsed sanctuary near Banias, where a shattered basalt idol towered above him despite lying in pieces. He measured the fragments with knotted twine, noting a forearm length of 1.8 meters. His parchment journal smells of lamp soot and beeswax, and the script tightens whenever he references the Sons of the Watchers. Monsoon rains that season had triggered landslides, covering much of the site in viscous mud, and Matthias recorded villagers striking bells to ward off aftershocks he attributed to restless giants. The bells trembled, the mud sighed, the hollow waited for obedient silence as rain stitched needles across the ravine. His attendants scraped mud from their boots with bronze knives, the sound a raspy counterpoint to the rain's drum on basalt. Later, he pressed damp lavender between the journal's pages, a tired attempt to mask the scent of landslide and legend intertwined. Crusader authorities later banned further pilgrimages there, citing safety, yet rumors whispered that relic hunters had vanished beneath the sliding earth after ignoring warnings. The sand remembers. Instruments hum. The hollow waits. The sand remembers. Instruments hum. The hollow waits. The sand remembers. Matthias's account carries the rustle of rain-soaked vellum, and when you imagine the bell's bronze vibration echoing off drenched basalt, the skin prickles with awareness that reverence sometimes masks fear of mud, not monsters. Could a visiting skeptic ignore villagers who inhale the petrichor and insist that the earth moves when legends are disturbed? Lantern flames reflected off puddles, multiplying the light into wavering columns that suggested towering sentries pacing beside the pilgrims. The storm's aftermath left cloaks heavy and cold, and each heartbeat thudded against wet fabric like a warning to retreat. The mixture of wet clay and crushed laurel leaves perfumed the air, and such scent would cling to robes long after the storm, reminding wearers that they trespassed into spaces rumor protected. Suppression happened through cautionary tales of swallowed pilgrims, stories repeated softly by hearths where steam rose from drying cloaks. In that damp hush, survival depended less on courage than on respecting community rhythms forged in the name of giants. Centuries later, in 1589, Ottoman scholar Khatib Salebi catalogued the same site in his Sihanuma, referencing a local emir who authorized controlled excavation to retrieve basalt for fortress repairs. Salebi's notes detail the use of iron wedges and water to fracture blocks, a method that filled the gully with metallic clangs and clouds smelling of wet stone. Labourers sang under their breath to steady nerves, their melodies flavoured with the smoke of mulberry charcoal burning in braziers atop the cliff. He observed inscriptions invoking Rephaim, carved upside down, indicating stones repurposed from a sanctum to a wall, a deliberate inversion to neutralize perceived potency. The emir halted the work after a landslide crushed 2 oxen teams, recording the accident as a sign to let the ruins sleep. The crushed oxen were buried on site, and fragrant pine resin was poured over the grave, a gesture both practical and supplicant. Rediscovery yielded to respectful retreat, the cycle etched into the ledger alongside grain taxes and rainfall logs. Reading Salebi's flowing script, ink shimmering a deep walnut hue on polished paper, you feel the tension between practical needs and the atmosphere of dread that lingered after the oxen's death. The scent of the manuscript, a mix of rosewater and gum arabic, softly asserts the care he invested in documenting the choice to desist. Would we, pressed by deadlines and metrics, recognize such an omen without pressing forward until more teams suffered? He describes the emir pausing before the fresh grave, the night breeze flapping his cloak like the wings of a sleepwalking bird. The manuscript edges absorbed the faint aroma of clove cigarettes, hinting at late-night revisits to the tale whenever doubt resurfaced. The story tastes of humility, a flavour rare in imperial reports, and the page edges curl slightly, as if they still absorb damp breezes from that ravine. Silence here stemmed from reverence tinged with grief, an emotion that folded the Nephilim myth into the practical governance of stone. In 1838, American explorer Edward Robinson walked the Bashan Plateau, his leather boots thudding on vesicular basalt that snagged each step, and he carefully measured dolmen capstones reaching widths of 5.5 meters. His journal recorded compass bearings taken with a prismatic instrument that flashed sunlight into his eyes, while his guide recited Arabic legends of Al-Jababira, the giants who once ruled the heights. Dust clogged Robinson's throat until each swallow rasped, and he noted how the setting sun painted the dolmens in copper hues that magnified their imposing silhouettes. His guide's horse snorted clouds of steam that smelled of hay and sweat, underscoring the chill that followed sunset. He compared the dolmens to Celtic barrows, yet admitted that their scale dwarfed anything he knew from Europe. Robinson tasted the metallic water from a cistern lined with lime, remarking on its bitterness and the chill that sank into his gut. The guide's warning that taxes followed curious foreigners hung in the air like wood smoke, a social pressure as tangible as any spear. His presence, another rediscovery, stirred local sheikhs to warn him away at dusk, citing jinn, but also worried that interest in the stones would bring tax collectors. Suppression returned in the form of reluctant hospitality, a social mechanism protecting both myth and livelihood. Robinson's narrative, read aloud under soft lamplight, creaks like saddle leather and carries the faint odour of campfire smoke absorbed into the paper fibres. He tried to rationalise the giants, yet his own words slow when describing twilight sweeping across basalt fields, as though the landscape itself lengthened time. What traveller today, armed with satellite maps, would heed a warning delivered in hushed tones over bitter tea. Their tea ceremony unfolded on a woven reed mat, the fibres creaking under shifting knees, and the embers cast blue sparks that drifted like willow wisps. Even the pause between sentences carried meaning, a gauzy silence that reminded Robinson he was tolerated, not embraced. The steam from that tea would carry cardamom and ash, encircling the conversation with warmth that hinted at boundaries. Silence in this instance emerged from wary diplomacy, a pause to protect community rhythms from the intrusions of foreign curiosity. Legends of the Nephilim became shields, and anyone unwilling to honor them risked becoming isolated before the first night ended. By 1934, the British Mandate's Department of Antiquities dispatched aerial photographer Amy Nimra to map megalithic structures across the Hauran, using a de Havilland DH-26 that rattled so hard the film canisters clicked like teeth. From 400 meters, she captured overlapping circles etched into black basalt, each casting long morning shadows that staggered like Titan footprints. The cockpit reeked of engine oil and sun-warmed canvas, and Nimra's leather gloves stuck to the controls as she banked over the ruins. Wind buffeted the wings with rhythmic thuds, and Nimra described gripping the fuselage so tightly that the taste of leather filled her mouth. She penciled coordinates onto maps that smelled of ink and dust, her handwriting elongated by the turbulence that kept her heart racing. Her photographic plates, developed in a tent smelling of fixer and damp cloth, revealed alignments matching solstitial sunrise angles within 2 degrees, confirming deliberate astronomical design. Vapors curled, the shutter sighed, the hollow traced light along memory as the pilot exhaled through a scarf of copper dust. Military censors, wary of leaking strategic terrain details, restricted publication, so her findings circulated quietly among scholars until after World War II. Nimra's private letters described the hush after landing, when the cooling engine ticked beneath a violet sunset and the smell of fuel mingled with desert blooms, a combination that lulled her into reverie. She wondered whether the giants were astronomical priests, not monstrous bodies, and the question softened the narrative without diminishing its gravity. Would a modern tourist, tuned to instant uploads, withstand the enforced secrecy that muffled her discovery for over a decade? She pressed wildflowers between the film sleeves, their petals drying into brittle confetti that still smells faintly of sun-warmed pollen when the archive box opens. Her restraint became an offering to the landscape, a vow whispered into the drone of cicadas surrounding the landing strip. The silence imposed by military caution felt metallic on her tongue, like biting a coin, yet she honored it, trusting that the images would eventually speak. That patience mirrors the very discipline we imagine the Nephilim demanding: endurance, discretion, and the ability to hold knowledge quietly within the chest. Geologists mapping the Golan Basalt Plateau note that the vesicular flows form labyrinthine tubes, some collapsing into sinkholes that exhale cold drafts smelling of iron and damp moss. Seismological data from the Dead Sea Transform indicates tremors every few decades during the Late Bronze Age, with magnitudes approximated at 6.5, enough to topple walls unless reinforced by oversized stones. The populace responded by constructing cyclopean facades, documented at sites like Tel Soreg, where blocks weigh upwards of 12 tons and were likely moved with log rollers coated in animal fat, a practice inferred from residue on preserved timbers. Thermal imaging taken at dusk shows pockets of retained heat glowing like embers beneath the crust, foreshadowing nighttime collapses accompanied by muffled thuds. Even today, hikers report a metallic ringing underfoot moments before a slab shifts, a warning bell tuned by geology rather than myth. The squeal of fat-soaked rollers on rock would have sounded like deep whale song, echoing through ravines as a warning. A modern visitor unused to terrain that shifts underfoot without warning would risk falling into a cooling vent or being crushed by a dislodged block long before mythical combat began. Imagining the squeal of those rollers under a twilight sky, the air thick with the scent of tallow and basalt dust, you realize that survival hinged on harmonizing with the landscape's groans. The legend of towering Nephilim may have been an attempt to personify vigilance itself, a constant watchfulness that listened for Earth's sighs. Could you sleep lightly enough to wake at the first pebble cascade, ready to brace a wall with rope and chant? Moonlight sliding over the rollers would have turned the fat sheen into silver ribbons, mesmerizing and nauseating all at once. The night air smelled of sweat seasoned with ash, and even the playful bark of dogs fell silent when the earth grumbled. In such settings, legends became lullabies for the vigilant, and anyone who failed to learn the tune would be swallowed by the night. Recent ADNA studies from tooth enamel excavated at WWII reveal high carbohydrate intake coupled with genetic markers for acromegaly-like growth, most likely caused by pituitary adenomas linked to inbreeding among elite warrior lineages. The lab smells of ethanol, latex, and the faint vanilla note of decontaminated cellulose, the environment sterile yet humming softly with centrifuges. Stable isotope analysis shows elevated nitrogen ratios indicative of carnivorous diets augmented by migratory waterfowl, a protein intake that would dwarf modern nutritional norms. Under microscopes, the enamel reveals striations filled with minute flecks of basalt dust inhaled during quarry labor, a gritty record of industrial breath. Mass spectrometry flickers across screens, and the beep of calibrations harmonizes with distant ventilation fans, creating a subdued symphony of science around the bones. Skeletal trauma patterns include compressed vertebrae and healed fractures consistent with wielding heavy weapons or sustaining collisions with battering engines. The data suggest individuals of unusual stature existed, but they paid for height with chronic pain and limited lifespan, a biological toll that would terrify an unprepared newcomer. Handling a cast of those elongated bones, the plaster chilled against gloves, you sense the bittersweet irony that giants may have suffered under the very expectations their size inspired. Laboratories murmur with ventilators, and the sterile air tastes of filtered dryness, yet imagination adds the copper tang of ancient blood rushing through enlarged arteries. Would a visitor truly envy the Nephilim after feeling the weight of a femur shaped by constant strain? Resting that cast across the forearms induces a subtle tremor, a reminder that tendons strain even in replicas, and the mind imagines the ache of carrying obsidian maces. The lab's light glances off polished surfaces, painting elongated shadows that resemble the very giants once conjured in stories. Silence in the lab is reverent not because of fear, but because understanding the cost of stature invites a quiet respect for bodies pushed beyond comfort. Ethnographic records from the early 1960s capture Druze elders in Majd al-Shams recounting night vigils where shepherds left bowls of milk on basalt outcrops for tall guests, who guarded flocks from raiders, a practice recorded alongside exact lunar phases. The gatherings smelled of ember-roasted barley and wild mint, while tambourines pulsed softly to summon protective attention from unseen allies. Saad's field notes describe how the bowls would frost over when night winds descended, the milk forming thin ice that cracked like delicate pottery. Children traced constellations with soot-blackened fingers, their whispers about towering guardians mingling with the smell of sheep lanolin and wood smoke. Anthropologist Layla Saad documented the ritual in reel-to-reel tapes, their magnetic spools ticking in rhythm with the tambourine, preserving instructions on where to place the bowls relative to Polaris's gleam. Night cooled, smoke thinned, the hollow leaned close. The watchers tasted dew-streaked offerings as crickets stitched silver threads of sound. Interviews reveal that the practice faded after a rockfall killed a shepherd, interpreted as a sign to cease, lest the guardians withdraw entirely. Listening to those tapes decades later, the tape hiss mingles with the recorded tambourine in a way that feels like distant breathing, and the mind drifts to a plateau rinsed in starlight. The milk offering glows in imagination, a pale disk scenting the air with animal warmth and grass. Could someone raised on electric fences comprehend a vigil that depends on invisible partners and precise star positions? The recording catches moments when elders pause to inhale, and the drawn breath rasps across aged vocal cords like wind through dry reeds. Their language glides between Arabic and Aramaic phrases, each syllable draped in reverence that tastes of salted cheese and shared memory. When the ritual ended after the rockfall, silence settled not from suppression but from grief, the community choosing to let the giants rest unbothered. The legend here becomes a tender boundary, one a stranger ignores at their peril. At the University of Haifa, researchers constructed a virtual reconstruction of a Nephilim-era fortified compound using LiDAR scans and paleo-environmental data, rendering humidity, wind speeds, and acoustic reverberation based on basalt density. Participants wearing haptic suits feel simulated stone textures cooling their skin, and ultrasonic emitters reproduce the drum resonance recorded at Rujam el-Hiri, vibrating through the chest cavity. Developers programmed olfactory cues, releasing a whisper of myrrh during dawn sequences so that users taste resin on the back of the tongue. Vibration plates underfoot mimic the tremor of marching columns, and the floor's subtle shiver turns calf muscles to water by the simulation's end. The lab smells faintly of ozone from projectors and the citrus tang of cleaning solvent, a modern echo of ancient aromatics. Physiological readings show heart rates spiking within minutes, particularly when virtual guard chants resonate at 72 beats per minute, creating entrainment that disrupts modern breathing patterns. The simulation demonstrates how a visitor today, deprived of acclimation, would struggle to regulate heartbeat and balance amid sensory overload. Removing the headset, subjects often describe a lingering phantom weight on their shoulders, as if a heavy cloak still rests there, and the sensation lingers like a shadow even under fluorescent lights. Sweat cools along the spine in metallic rivulets, and participants often rub their wrists as if heavy cuffs remain. Would you willingly re-enter after feeling your pulse surrender to ancient rhythms not your own? The laboratory's HVAC sighs overhead, yet ears keep straining for drums that no longer sound, proof that the experience plants echoes in muscle memory. The hum of the lab persists, yet minds wander to torchlit corridors and the faint taste of mineral water shared in fear. The reflective pause smells of warm circuitry and human sweat, a reminder that even in simulation the giant's world refuses to accommodate modern expectations. Silence becomes a recalibration period, a gentle insistence on respecting the tempo of a myth made palpable again. Climatologists reconstructing late Bronze Age weather patterns from speleothems in the Saurik cave identify oscillations between drought and sudden deluge, a volatility echoed in sediment cores from the Sea of Galilee showing rapid flood deposits. Stalagmites in the cave glow under UV light, revealing growth bands that smell faintly of damp chalk when touched. Inhabitants built terraced reservoirs lined with hydraulic plaster, whose fragments still emit a chalky smell when dampened, to capture precious runoff. Failure meant dehydration under relentless sun, where temperatures soared above 34 degrees C by day only to plunge at night, forcing bodies to endure thermal stress cycles. Farmers responded by storing dried figs coated in sesame, a sticky ration that fused sweetness with salt to keep guards awake during parched patrols. Clay tablets list rations of salted fish and date cakes laced with beerwort to maintain electrolytes, a diet that would shock modern metabolisms. Thunder boomed across open plains, reverberating like distant drums, and lightning reflected off basalt to produce ghostly afterimages that could send unprepared eyes reeling. Standing within a reconstructed reservoir, the plaster cool against fingertips, you sense the desperation that sculpted each curve to trap water that smelled faintly of algae and lime. Survival in the Giants' Age required trusting in engineered slopes and communal rationing that tolerated no selfish thirst. Crickets chant from terrace walls, their rhythms syncing with the drip of water into storage jars, a gentle percussion that soothes even as it warns of scarcity. The wind carries hints of baked mud and crushed thyme, fragrances that promise comfort if rationed wisely. Could you control your sips when neighbors watched for fairness with the intensity of sentinels? The sky's violet hour would invite both relief and dread, and the first breeze after sunset carried dust tasting of copper and wild sage. The legend of the Nephilim becomes a reminder that discipline can feel taller than any body, and the mind bows to expectations older than memory. Psychologists analysing ritual tablets from Ugarit note that many incantations include deliberate pauses marked by triple dots, instructing singers to hold silence long enough for listeners to feel chest pressure, a technique mirrored today in diaphragmatic breathing training. The clay tablets, cool and gritty, release a faint earthy odour when warmed by handling, grounding the reader in the same sensory world as ancient chanters. Markers for the pauses were sometimes smeared with blue glaze derived from azurite, and flakes still glitter beneath magnification like trapped sky. Participants in modern reconstructions describe their fingertips tingling as the silence extends, an almost electric sensation spreading through the ribcage. Reconstructed ceremonies in experimental archaeology settings showed participants experiencing mild hypoxia when they adhered to the pauses, inducing euphoria followed by exhaustion. Flutes whispered, torches guttered, the hollow matched heartbeats with patient gravity, while shadows folded like velvet across expectant faces. Such practices trained participants to ride waves of oxygen deprivation, a skill modern lungs rarely possess, and the inability to comply could mark a stranger as untrustworthy. Attempt the breathing yourself in a quiet room, and the chest tightens sooner than pride allows. The air tasting suddenly of clay even if you sit oceans away. The pause stretches, weighted by ancestral expectation, and ears ring with phantom flutes. Would you confess to the elders that your lungs failed, risking banishment from the circle? When you open your eyes too soon, the darkness seems to thicken in gentle reprimand, smelling faintly of candle wax and cooling stones. The body learns humility in that hush, acknowledging that breath itself can be a communal covenant rather than a solitary act. Silence here carries the softness of velvet invoked in the incantation, yet its grip is firm, guiding each inhale and exhale with invisible hands. The Nephilim legend resides in that pressure, in the steady insistence that community breathes together or not at all. Administrative tablets from Hazor enumerate service rotations for mighty men, scheduling night watches in 2-hour segments, and imposing fines measured in silver shekels and sesame oil for anyone who slept on duty. The tablets smell of baked clay and faint soot, and the wedge impressions are so deep they catch shadow even in diffused light. Tablet edges display chew marks from rodents, a reminder that even meticulous systems battled mundane threats under smoky ceilings. Guard reports mention dew-soaking cloaks before dawn, the moisture-chilling spines, while distant owls hooted agreements with the night's vigilance. Oil lamps used during rounds burned animal fat infused with juniper, producing a sweet, smoky aroma that clung to wool cloaks. Patrol routes wound over slick basalt stairs where moss bloomed in shaded crevices, so guards strapped leather sandals with copper hobnails that sparked faintly in darkness. The system relied on relentless vigilance, and the penalties suggest that failing any portion, whether diet, discipline, or scent masking, could cost a life or freedom within hours. Imagine taking that watch, the juniper smoke kissing your throat, while copper sparks beneath your feet draw constellations on the stairs. The silver fines translate into months of labour, and the sesame oil would otherwise season the sparse meals that keep muscles supple. Could you keep your eyelids from drooping when the night insects serenade with lullaby rhythms? Fellow sentries shared dried figs dusted with ash to keep mouths alert, the gritty sweetness painting tongues with determination. Each rotation ended with a whispered blessing over the oil stores, a murmur that tasted of faith and fatigue intertwined. The air thickens with the promise of punitive dawns, and the stars glimmer like watchful eyes above, refusing to close. Legends of Nephilim might have flourished simply because only giants, real or imagined, could bear such schedules without breaking. Comparative mythology studies link the Nephilim to Hurrian tales of the Kumabi cycle, where skyborn titans fall to earth, narratives preserved on clay tablets that smell of damp straw and exhibit fingerprints of scribes pressed beside cuneiform wedges. Archaeologists uncovered these texts in Hattusa, within archival chambers whose stone floors remained slick with ancient wax drippings from torches. The archivists found hearth ash fused into the floor, and when crushed, it released a ghost of roasted barley that transported readers into ancient feasts. Copper bells discovered nearby still jingle when handled, their sound thin yet insistent, like distant reminders of Titan banquets. The tablets list offerings of barley beer spiced with coriander, suggesting ceremonial feasts that mingled intoxicating warmth with thunderous recitations. Cross-references in Egyptian execration texts mention great ones of Bashan, showing the motif travelling along trade routes perfumed by frankincense and packed with copper ingots. The diffusion underscores that the age of the Nephilim was less a single event than a regional consensus about power wielded by those who mastered land, ritual, and rumour. Tracing those fingerprints across continents, you feel the papery drag of history against your own skin, and the air fills with phantom coriander and torch smoke. Letters between traders mention exchanging myths as bargaining chips, their papyrus crackling like dry leaves when unfolded in museum stacks. Could a traveller survive among cultures that expected such seamless blending of myth and governance without surrendering their familiar frameworks? The faint aroma of aged linen wraps these stories, and even in climate-controlled rooms, the whispers feel warm against the ear. The legends drift like incense, coating the tongue with sweetness that hides a bite. Silence across these corridors is not empty. It is saturated with the footfalls of messengers who carried rumours like delicate pottery. Respecting that weight becomes the only safe passage through the night. Modern speleologists exploring the lava tubes beneath Mount Susita discovered skeletal remains of goats arranged in semicircles, radiocarbon dated to the early Iron Age, accompanied by basalt pestles stained with ochre, implying sacrificial feasts held underground to honour subterranean guardians. The tubes exhale air smelling of wet ashes and mineral-rich humidity, and the walls glitter with calcite that catches torchlight in shards. Navigating requires crawling over jagged slag where a misstep slices boots, and CO2 monitors beep softly to warn of rising concentrations that numb limbs within minutes. Water drips from the ceiling in syncopated beats, spattering onto tongues with a mineral tang that numbs taste buds within moments. Bats roosting overhead release a musky scent that layers with the ochre's iron bite, crafting an atmosphere as rich as any incense-filled temple. Lights dimmed, echoes stretched. The hollow listened as droplets counted lost time upon the stone. These chambers illustrate how devotion drove communities into environments where a modern visitor would suffocate or bleed before encountering any mythical defender. Emerging from the imagined depths, the night air feels both lighter and charged, carrying whispers of basalt dust, frankincense, and the distant heartbeat of drums that may never have existed, yet still guide the pulse. The age of the Nephilim lingers in measurements etched into stone, in breaths held between chants, in the ache of muscles trained to obey ancient tempos. We taste their world in bitterness and sweetness alike, knowing that survival demanded surrender to architectures of rhythm and reverence that modern minds unspooled long ago. The breeze grazes the skin with cool fingers, and somewhere a nightjar calls, its note a soft arrow through the dark. Footsteps slow of their own accord, savouring the mingled aromas of soil and distant resin fires, content to let the unanswered linger. The mystery stays awake, breathing beside us, suggesting that some histories endure as atmospheres rather than answers.